All right, so I'm Zach Thibault, and I am now presenting my home optics presentation. Hopefully, the internet will keep up this time, unlike yesterday. As you can see, I got to stay at Bethel over this quarantine, so I was able to work in AMO labs. So I decided to work on an external cavity diode laser and learning how to lase it, as well as prepare a transparent optical cavity for my optics research project. So basic goals behind this project. First, I wanted to understand external cavity diode lasers more, ECDLs. I wanted to understand how they work when they use gratings, because I've worked with ECDLs and it has to involve filters, but not gratings. Then I wanted to work with an ECDL that Dan Upcraft made last summer. I wanted to align it and be able to demonstrate that it can be tuned across different wavelengths. And then I wanted to use that ECDL laser to search for a transparent optical cavity length, which I'll describe to you what that means in more detail later. And then lastly, I wanted to make sure I didn't get kicked out of the labs by Bethel security. I feel like this kind of sounds bad, especially after Alex singled me out in his presentation yesterday. So I would like to clarify that in the midst of my research, I do not believe I have broken any of the Bethel rules, except maybe for staying in the buildings later than I was supposed to. But other than that, I feel like I've been doing a good job. All right, so external cavity diode lasers. First off, what's a diode laser? It's shown in the picture on the right here. As you can see, it's a little electronic chip that you send the current to, and it sends out a laser. It's a coherent light source. So basically, it means it sends out a nice little laser, a few milliwatts usually, maybe a little more. And it gives out a specific range of frequencies. Usually it's maybe within a half nanometer or something, a range. So it's a little bit too broad of a width half max frequency for a lot of scientific tools such as spectroscopy. So it's a useful thing, but it's not perfect on its own. So to combine that with an external cavity, which we've learned about in optics, we've learned about Fabry-Pro cavities where light bounces back and forth between two mirrors. If there's a gain material inside, the laser gets stronger. So that's in essence how an external cavity diode laser works. So inside this little diode laser, at the back end of it, there's a reflective substance, and in front of that, there's a positive and negative junction that is producing the photons that send out light. Now, if you have an external cavity that sends light back into those photons into the diode, and you also in that external cavity have a way of only returning specific light, so light at one single wavelength instead of the range of wavelengths that the diode is sending out. The diode will see that light that is returned to it, and because of stimulated emission, it will learn to only produce light that's exactly the same as the light that is reflected back into it. So you're only reflecting a very narrow range of wavelengths of light back into the diode will soon learn to produce at full power only light at that wavelength, so it'll become a very narrow laser. And there's a couple different design options for this. So I'll just tell you about this design, the ECDL Josh. Don't know why it's labeled Josh, but on the far right, the box is labeled Josh, so I went with that. This is a grating ECDL. So we start here with a picture inside the box. There's the diode, and then there's a grating over here, this clear looking square on the left. And then over here is, on the top left, is a mirror that reflects light through the hole in the box, which is the output. And then there's another mirror which takes a reflection off the grating, a diffraction off the grating, and returns light directly back into the grating and eventually back into the diode. So there's a diagram here below, and this type of ECDL is following the B diagram, the Littman-Metcalfe configuration, where light hits the diffraction grating and one order of light bounces off the output, and the other order of light bounces toward a mirror. mirror reflects light directly back into the grating if it's aligned properly, and then the light bounces off the grating, goes back to the diode, so it follows the exact same path it came, and then the diode uh, sees that light and learns to only produce light at whatever wavelength of light uh, bounced off the diffraction grating properly. And the mirror, if you see a little arrow right here, you can see it's adjustable back and forth. So at slightly different angles, it'll catch different wavelengths of light that have been diffracted because they've been spread out by the grating, and it'll send different wavelengths of light back to the laser diodes. So as you adjust this mirror, you can actually adjust what wavelength of light the output is because it'll adjust what wavelength of light the diode learns to laze at. So once I figured that out, I had to begin the alignment process. So basically that was a lot of adjusting the knobs on that wavelength selection mirror that I told you about right here. This is a snapshot from the optical spectrum analyzer we have in the lab, the OSA, when I was just beginning just to get lasing. So the peak on the right is what the light, basically the light that the diode would laze at on its own, the light that it would send out. And the peak on the left is the light that was being caught by the wavelength selection mirror and returned back to the diode. So the peak on the right is what the diode just does naturally. The peak on the left is caused by the stimulated emission as the diode is starting to learn to only emit light at that wavelength. And as I adjusted the horizontal knob on the mirror, I could see that left peak I could move across from about 684 nanometers all the way to up to about 689 as I rotated the mirror. So I knew that peak was being caused by the lasing of the ETDL. I also knew that because if I blocked the selection mirror, that the external cavity would disappear, so that peak would just completely disappear. After maybe another hour, a few more hours, a little more work and alignment, I eventually, with both the horizontal and vertical mirrors to make sure light was being returned perfectly as well as it could be back into the diode, I got one nice laser peak here, which I can move between 684 and 689 nanometers. The resolution of the OSA that I'm using doesn't quite tell me how narrow of a range of wavelengths that is. You can see one box is 1 nanometer for division, so that makes it look like the full width half max of it is maybe 0.2 or 0.3 nanometers, but I think it's actually narrower than that. I think the OSA just doesn't have a narrow enough resolution to tell me that it's narrower than that. A key part of the alignment I forgot to mention earlier was also I realized that the diode needed to be powered at full power. Originally, I was only powering at about 70 or 80 milliamps, and it just wasn't quite enough power to get the diode to blaze the ECDL consistently. But once I increased that power to 110 milliamps, much better. I was also temperature stabilizing this diode at 41 degrees Celsius to make sure it stayed steady. And basically, once I got to this point, I could see that the ECDL was working really well because I had this nice peak that's 25 decibels, so in close to 1,000 times higher intensity than all the noise below it. And it was tunable, really easy to just turn the horizontal knob of the mirror and move it back and forth about a 5 nanometer range, which is pretty cool. Be able to have a laser that just moves like that. My next steps was to try to find a transparent optical cavity length. This didn't go as well as hoped. The basic idea is shown on the picture on the far right. Light is there's two mirrors. You can look at the diagram, might be more helpful. There's two mirrors that keep the light that don't have a coating on either side, so some light is allowed to travel through, and basically light gets trapped. Some of the light gets trapped inside these two mirrors and then eventually goes out. But the key idea here is if you get light to return directly in line with the incoming beam, and if it's also perfectly in phase with the incoming beam, that this first mirror will become transparent. The light will just travel through it without being slowed down or weakened at all, which is pretty cool. And it will happen if I get the length of this cavity perfectly right, because then the returning beam will be perfectly in phase with the incoming beam's phase. Never quite got that working though. Like this diagram, it shows what it's supposed to look like in the end, but I had about 5 milliwatts of light going into the optical cavity, and I only ever got 32 microwatts out of the cavity. So I don't really think I got this working. I've got a picture. I was using a Thor camera to look at the laser, and there's a picture of what it looked like, and I was getting like light to go through, and I could see that I could test that I had this alignment in place, so the return beam inside the cavity was perfectly in line with the incoming laser, but I tried changing the length with piezos, and I never got an increase in power, so I guess I just never got perfectly in phase while also being adjusted and aligned. Some closing thoughts brought to you by current twins closer Taylor Rogers. Creating ECDLs work well to create narrow tunable lasers. It's fun to be able to build one of those, or not build, but align one of those. Finding a transparent optical cavity length is hard. Spent quite a bit of time on that and never really had much success. And finally, the AMO lab is really a great place to study slash play music slash hide in. It's basically where I've been living the last 2 months doing all my homework at. So should hang out there some because it's pretty cool. This is the end of my presentation. You can, I guess, email me questions if you have any. Feel free to do that. And I'm going to turn off this recording if the internet allows me.